The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. We are very pleased that you have elected to join us this morning. My name is Tracy Zimmerman. I'm the Executive Director of the North Carolina Early Childhood Foundation, and you are joining the webinar, Choosing the Most Promising Early Literacy Interventions. I am absolutely thrilled to have with us today Munro Richardson, who is the executive director of Read Charlotte. There is absolutely amazing work happening across the state and happening in Charlotte and Mecklenburg County through Monroe's work at Read Charlotte, which is a community initiative. And Monroe will tell you a little bit more about this. But they have a very bold goal of doubling the number of children that are reading on grade level from 2015 by 2025. So they have a goal of 80%. That's not a small goal, and Monroe has embraced that and is running forward at top speed to bring that to fruition. He is responsible for using research and data and strategic funding to really coordinate and integrate all of the efforts that are happening in Charlotte-Mecklenburg to improve children's language and literacy development. He and his team have done a tremendous amount of work at really looking at what is the early literacy pathway and what are the practices that we can hold up and would produce really the best outcomes for our young children. And so, as many of you may know, the North Carolina Early Childhood Foundation, along with its partners at Best NC Child, and the North Carolina Partnership for Children, Smart Start, have been working with leaders across the state on the North Carolina pathways to grade level reading. And clearly, this is a critical approach and information to ensure that our children help get there. We focus on the whole child, and a key part of that is high quality interactions and instruction from the adults and caregivers in their lives. So I am going to happily turn it over to Monroe, who is going to share his expertise and the work that his team has done over the past, I was going to say several months, Monroe, but I think it's fair to say now a couple of years.
That's right. Well, thank you, Tracy, and thanks to the North Carolina Early Childhood Foundation for this opportunity to share this morning about a topic that we're very passionate about, which is really trying to understand what are some of the most promising early literacy interventions that we can support. So Tracy's going to help navigate for me this morning. So you're going to hear me say next slide as we move forward. So Tracy, next slide. So Read Charlotte is, as Tracy mentioned, we're a 10-year initiative that coordinates, integrates, and aligns people, resources, and data to double third grade reading proficiency from 39% in 2015 to 80% by 2025. We use the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP. Fourth grade reading scores is our proxy for those numbers, so it may look a little different than numbers we're used to looking at for the EOG here in the state of North Carolina. But that allows us to actually look back all the way to 2003. It also allows us to compare Charlotte-Mecklenburg with about 24 other large urban districts around the state. But one thing that's important to know is that we don't run programs. We have dozens of programs already in the community. Our job really is to help coordinate, integrate, and align all of the work that's happening so that we can have more impact. I've been really fortunate to be in the role of executive director for almost 3 years now. And one of the first questions that I had coming in was what can actually move the needle for children, and what needles do we need to pay attention to? I had spent about 2 years on the board of a similar third grade campaign in Kansas City. So I've been thinking about this a lot before I came to Charlotte. And so what I want to do is share with you a little bit about what we've done over the last 3 years, Second, I want to encourage you, all of you, to shamelessly steal anything that you think might be of value to you. But lastly, I really do want to show you one approach to trying to determine what are the needles that you might need to move in your communities, and then how do you pick promising interventions. And hopefully what I'm able to share this morning, you'll be able to apply to perhaps other interventions that we haven't looked at or other indicators that we haven't looked at as well. Next slide, please. So today's agenda, we're going to really cover two things. One, talk about our approach to selecting early literacy indicators. And then second, we're going to talk about how we approach choosing promising interventions, birth to 5 and K3. And then we're going to, kind of talk about some of the ones that we found, and then leave time open for Q&A. Next slide, please. So first, selecting early literacy indicators. Next slide. So our approach was to map backwards from 3rd grade proficiency and to look for predictors that will improve the odds of this outcome. So what we asked were, what were all the skills and competencies that children that are able to read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade needed to have, regardless of zip code, native language, ethnicity. What do all kids need to be able to do? And then we map backwards to birth, and we were trying to find a core set of indicators. Next slide. We had 5 criteria for picking powerful indicators. The first was, does it predict 3rd grade reading? Is it powerful? And we were looking for indicators that actually either directly to 3rd grade reading outcomes, or perhaps through each other, were predicting whether kids are more or less likely to read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. Second, was there credible research to support it? Was there evidence, right, that this is an important indicator? Third, was it relevant to literacy? And we were looking for literal connections for indicators, as opposed to ones that were maybe more contextual. Fourth, is it feasible to collect and report? Thinking about the cost and effort, we could think about lots of things that we might think are important, but if we can't collect and report on it, we didn't think it was as powerful an indicator for us to focus on. And then lastly, will it respond to strategy? Did we believe that we could move the needle? And what I think is really important to keep in mind, of course, is we have a 10-year window. We only have 7 years left now. So it was important for us to find indicators that we thought that we actually had a reasonable chance of being able to impact. Next slide, please. So our focus really largely was on foundational reading skills. Many of you have probably seen this before. This is Scarborough's reading rope, but we paid a lot of attention to this and mined it for a lot of the indicators that we researched and evaluated. But really 2 big areas, as you can see, language, and then word recognition, learning to be able to identify words. And obviously with this picture very elegantly illustrates is that if kids don't acquire those early skills, as they go further along, they're not able to weave that rope tightly and to be able to be skilled readers by the end of 3rd grade and beyond. Next slide, please. So we took these set of indicators and came up with 8 research-based indicators, and you can see here on the slide they run from expressive language and what we call language comprehension, but it's receptive language, all the way through letter knowledge, approaches to learning in preschool age, phonemic awareness, which is critical skill that spans both before kids start school and after, phonics and decoding, reading level and school attendance. For you all, I've gone back and thought that if there was an additional indicator I would have added, it would have been fluency. So I changed it to 9, and you can see it starred. But these really comprise the indicators that we selected. Next slide. For those of us that are here in North Carolina, the good news is there are data for all of these. We are very fortunate to be in a state where there's really robust collection of data, especially for K3, formative assessments, and then obviously the EOG. For birth to 5, we have been challenged in Mecklenburg County like I think a number of counties are and a number of communities, around having enough birth to 5 data. We did a lot of work to review what were all the different assessments that were available. And we here in Mecklenburg County have been working to start to slowly build capacity around using 2 versions of the individual growth and development indicators, the infant and toddler indicators, and then the IGDs, and then the preschool IGDs. And so both of those, as you can see noted, will allow us to measure almost all of those indicators, the only exception being approaches to learning. And then for communities and programs that are using Teaching Strategies Gold, it certainly can address all of those early critical birth to 5 indicators as well. So the good news is there are sources for these indicators, certainly in the state of North Carolina. Next slide, please. So we've organized all of these indicators into what we call the reading success pathway. And I mentioned earlier that our interests was in identifying what are all the critical skills and competencies kids need to master. This doesn't even begin to encapsulate all of the things that children need. We know that there are 5 domains of early childhood development. We know that what families do and the environment they're in matters. We know things like toxic stress matters. But what we looked at was what are all the critical competencies that kids need to acquire to be able to be proficient in 3rd grade. And then we think about those other issues largely in systemic context or systems level issues that together with community partners, we look at how we need to address those so that kids are on the pathway. This also has been a way that we've socialized those indicators. And I think so far it's been very effective for us. Our focus for all of our work, all of the partners we work with, all the programs we support is to make sure that we're keeping kids on the pathway, and if they fall off the pathway, that we get them back on as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. So out of all this work, there really were 3 high leverage indicators that really came out of our research: letter knowledge, phonemic awareness, and phonics. We've known from the National Early Learning Panel that letter knowledge and phonics, I'm sorry, this should not say phonics, it should say phonemic awareness, are the 2 greatest cognitive predictors at school entry. Kids that are strong in these 2 skills actually do better in reading the first couple of years. We know that unfortunately kids who are behind at the end of kindergarten are likely to be behind at the end of 1st grade, and the national data are that only 12% of 1st graders who are behind catch up by the end of 3rd grade. So it really clarified for us that there were some real critical skills that we needed to pay attention to, and that even though we talk about birth to 3rd grade, that the odds of children being able to read proficiently by 3rd grade really begin to change as early as kindergarten entry, and certainly by the end of 1st grade. And so that really helps us to know that those are critical indicators that we need to pay attention to. Next slide, please. So again, this just shows you the reading pathway again, and you can see we've circled those 3 critical indicators, and you can see then, as you think about the work in your community, how paying attention to these indicators really could be important leverage points on the pathway of kids to 3rd grade reading proficiency. Next slide. So the big picture for us is if we can move the needle on these indicators, we increase the chances that children will read proficiently by 3rd grade. And so we, next slide. A great indication of this would be DIBELS, which, in the entire state of North Carolina, kids are assessed in various DIBELS measures from K through 3. And you might have heard like different cut points for DIBELS. One of those is that benchmark, and obviously benchmark sounds like something you want to happen, but the folks behind DIBELS at the University of Oregon will tell you that if we get a child reading at benchmark on various measures, they have a 70–85% chance of meeting their subsequent early literacy goals. If we get them above benchmark, that increases to 90–99% chance. So the fact that these data are collected, across the state and our school districts, there are data that are available that, in partnership with the school districts, we could use those to understand how are our kids at a population level, progressing down the reading success pathway, and then how might we think about organizing local efforts to get kids either continue to move down the pathway or to get kids back on the pathway who've fallen off. Next slide, please. So that's how we approached our selecting our early literacy indicators. And what I want to now do is kind of shift to how we use that information to choose promising interventions to support here in Mecklenburg County. Next slide, please. So, you know, our first question, we had two questions, right? So we had these indicators, and our questions were, what works to move these indicators, and how do we know? And we looked for really high quality research that shows cause and effect. And what we were looking for was research that would compare the results for children who participate in a program with similar children not in a program. And we looked for studies that had our indicators as outcomes. And what that would tell us is how well a program could, or how much a program rather, could contribute to helping a child who had needed help on one of those indicators, and could, you know, help us at a community level get more kids down the reading success pathway. Next slide. So we're very fortunate, I think, today, certainly compared to 3 years ago, that for the first time in the elementary reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, they've named specifically the importance of evidence-based or evidence-informed interventions, and actually defined tiers of evidence in the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so tier 1 is what they call strong evidence that's supported by one or more well-designed and implemented randomized controlled trials or experimental studies. Tier 2 is similar, except it's quasi-experimental studies or matching between kids who got a program and kids who look very similar to them. The third tier is well-designed or implemented correlational studies, with the caveat that correlation is not causation, but you can't have causation without correlation. So correlation tells us something. And then the last level is, practice that's got a strong logic, model, theory of action. There's some research and some effort underway to determine their effectiveness. Next slide, please. What you can see, what I want to point out is that for our work, we really focus on tier 1 and tier 2 levels of evidence. We had a strong preference for programs that had good support for tier 1 type evidence, and we actually preferred studies that had more than one randomized study to help support it. Next slide, please. So we reviewed over 24 databases here in the US and in the UK. And what I will tell you is, unfortunately, there is no one database that you can go to and has all of the programs that are out there. As great as the What Works Clearinghouse is, it doesn't have everything. And sometimes the databases don't agree with each other. They may say different things about the same program, which is why it took so much effort for us to pour through them and read through the programs carefully. We were guided by the indicators, which was important for us. And the caveat I would tell you is there may be some other indicators or other predictors of how children will do in reading or other outcomes that you care about, that if it wasn't on our list, we didn't look for it. So, when we talk about what specific interventions that we've identified, I just want to caveat that there may be others that if they didn't have evidence around one of those indicators, we weren't looking for them. We had to kind of be disciplined in our search. Next slide. So one of the challenges in this work is, oftentimes we've got this kind of, theory to practice gap, and we need to try to figure out how do we translate what can be fairly esoteric research into information that we can actually use, that practitioners like all of us can use to make decisions. And so what I'm going to try to do in the next few slides is to really show how we try to approach this, and to take kind of fairly technical information and to translate it into more readily interpretable data. Next slide. So the first thing I wanted to really highlight is this question of how do we think about impact? And you know, to measure the impact of an intervention, we really want to compare the effects of participants in a program versus non-participants who are just like them. And there are two main ways to create these groups. One is either through random assignment, where you have a treatment and a control group. That's like the tier 1 interventions that under ESSA. Or we can create match groups, right? So we can have a group of children who got a program, and then find a comparison group that we, you know, statistically control for that looks just, you know, very similar to them. And so these are really the two main ways to create these two groups. There are other ways, perhaps, to try to tease out correlations. But when we're talking about trying to talk about impact, these are the two main ways, and this is what we look for in the studies that we reviewed. Next slide. So when you think about these two groups, one thing that's important to keep in mind is that for any program, you're going to have a range of results, right? Not every child is going to do the same. We often report the average, but the reality is there are a range of results. And one way to think about it, we have a bell curve here. Sometimes a lot of our data is distributed under, it will look like a bell curve or normally distributed. And this is a very helpful way for just us to think about this in very simple terms. But that black line is, you know, the average, or what's known as the mean, and you've got a range of outcomes that are happening for kids. And so you've got a similar kind of distribution for kids who got the program, and you got a similar distribution for kids who didn't get the program. And so our question is how do we understand the effect of a program when we compare this distribution and maybe differences in the average outcome for kids? Next slide. So an effect size is a simple way of quantifying this difference between these two groups. It can be applied to any outcome that you're interested in education or in social science more broadly. It allows us to compare any two programs, and it moves beyond simple statistical significance to substantive significance. And for any of you that you know, perhaps have had evaluations done on programs that you support or care about, one of the things that I would highly encourage you to kind of take away from today's webinar is to really ask your evaluators to not just tell you something that's statistically significant, but to really help you understand what is the substantive significance of whatever the program that you're evaluating. Next slide. So this picture shows you, if you think about the 2 slides ago where you had the first bell curve distribution, this shows you 2 different groups. The curve on the left is the control group. The curve on the left, or the right rather, is the group that got the program, the treatment. And what we're measuring, we're able to do with statistics is to measure the difference between the two. And that's what's called an effect size. I won't go into the how that's done, but this is really what we mean when we talk about an effect size. And we want to account for what's the difference, right, in that distribution of results between a group of kids who got program and a group of kids who didn't. And the number that gets kind of spit out allows us to compare the magnitude of effect of a program for any 2 programs. It even allows us to think about different programs on the same outcome. So it's a very effective way, an easy way for us to understand impact of programs. Next slide. The challenge with this is that this may be a great way for people that use statistics all the time to understand programs, but we really need to take the extra effort to translate that kind of statistical language into terms that are easier to understand. So I have here, and I think you'll all be able to have access to these slides afterwards, a great resource that worked on this and was published a little over 5 years ago that I use a lot to understand the substantive importance of different programs. And one of the things that's really important about this is that we have enough information to be able to benchmark outcomes, particularly for K3, and to be able to look at any programs, the effect size, and compare it to what we would otherwise expect to see for an intervention like that at the elementary level. Information for that's also available at middle and high school levels as well, and for math, and for reading, literacy, and for math as well. Next slide. So typically the way that we talk about these kind of interventions, and even for when you've got a benchmark, is to say something like the median effect size of an evidence-based phonics intervention is 0.17. That's actually from that report. And so what we want to do is then take that and make it even more interpretable for folks. Next slide. So we can borrow from public health a concept called number needed to treat. And for any of you in public health, I know this is a very familiar term. For those of you for whom this may be new, there's a link at the bottom of this slide to a great New York Times article about this concept. I read it a couple of years ago, and it's really what turned me on to this approach. But basically, we can take that exact same number, 0.17 effect size, and turn it into this. For every 15 children served, the typical evidence-based phonics intervention will help 1 to have a better literacy outcomes. Next slide. We can then even make that even more interpretable and to say out of every 100 children served, the typical evidence-based phonics intervention will help 7 to have better literacy outcomes. And this is, I also have a tool, a link at the bottom for one of my favorite resources to convert effect sizes into these kinds of numbers. But I find this really helpful because it helps us to kind of ground our expectations in what the magnitude of impact a program potentially could have that we might select. It really shows you why it's important to also focus on both intervention fidelity as well as implementation fidelity, because unless we implement the program as intended and we make sure that we're delivering it with a level of quality we won't even get this number. So, but this really helps to anchor us, particularly when we're evaluating other interventions. It gives us a way to kind of understand it and to think about how effective an intervention may or may not be relative to other interventions. Next slide. So the one thing you should take away is that there really are no silver bullets, and we can put numbers to it. So again, using the same approach, what's called absolute risk reduction, assuming that 46.1% of North Carolina third graders will score at college and career ready, which is what we got statewide in 2017, on narrow literacy skills like letter knowledge or phonics, the typical evidence-based program will improve outcomes for 7 out of 100 elementary children. On broader skills like fluency and comprehension, or just kind of an overall reading achievement outcome, the typical evidence-based program will improve outcomes for about 3 out of 100 elementary children. If those feel like low numbers to you, yes, they are. And this is why it's so important for us to have an awareness of what the expected impact of any program we're considering is, and to ask the question what the evidence is. And this is why it's important to go beyond just statistical significance, because you could have a statistically significant outcome that will improve outcomes for 1 child. So this is a really important step in our review, and I would suggest for you as well for programs you're considering. Next slide, please. So we use, it says 5 criteria, I should say 6, sorry about that. 6 criteria for selecting interventions. The first one, is there evidence of this intervention that can move the needle on 1 or more indicators? Second, is there evidence for the population we seek to serve? That's important. Your populations will all be different, so it's important to try to pay attention to that. Third, how strong is the evidence for this specific intervention? And we just kind of talked about, how to think about that. And I also think about the both the size of the sample size, or just say the number of kids that were in a study, as well as how many studies are there to support a specific intervention. Sometimes it's really hard to say, a small study, well-designed, that had 60 children in it, that had a nice effect size. We should build a strategy around that for 6,000 children. You just want to think about that and think about how comfortable you feel with the strength of the evidence. Fourth, does the projected size of the impact of this intervention meet or exceed what we would normally expect to see for a given outcome? Fifth, what is the likely cost-benefit calculation for this intervention? And then 6, what are the risks of, we call execution failure? How hard is it to implement this, right? And there are various ways to think about that. Next slide. Today, we're just going to focus on the first 4. But I really would encourage you to think hard about number 5 and 6. Next slide. I'm going to pause for a slight commercial interruption right now. So the information we're providing today is a courtesy. If there are mistakes, we're sorry about it, but we don't want to assume any responsibility for errors, although we tried really hard. We only focus on specific language and literacy indicators that we looked at, as I mentioned earlier. So there could be impacts on other indicators that you care about. We just didn't look for those. Third, I would highly recommend you use the Hexagon tool. Check it out at the National Implementation Research Network website. I've included the link for that. It's a really great tool to help you think about how do you select which evidence-based interventions are right for your community. Next slide. So here is a set of birth to 5 interventions that we went going through this process that in 2017 here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, we began to, as we say, stack and online. And what you can see here are the numbers, are the number out of 100 children that we would expect to see with improved outcomes compared to just kind of normal interventions or normal experiences. So Reach Out and Read, Ready for K, Raising a Reader, Story Talk, and Active Reading. And as you can see, those numbers vary significantly, but they all are higher than the benchmarks that we shared earlier. A caveat is that the resources that we have that we use to derive kind of those benchmarks are for elementary school. We have not been able to find similar for birth to 5 or pre-K specifically. So I just want to provide that caveat that we're aware that we're using benchmarks that may not entirely fit for pre-K especially, but it's the best that we have at this point. One other thing I want to point out, and this is a really good thing just to be clear about, in this case you see number 3, Raising a Reader, and it's got the number 9. And what that means is we'd expect to see 9 out of 100 kids with improved outcomes. Family nights where they brought families together monthly produced that outcome. But the comparison was a really high quality childcare program. And so what's important for all of these studies is to always try to understand what was the comparison group, because the comparison really matters in terms of as we're trying to think about the effect size. So my belief is that in a typical childcare setting, you would actually see that number be significantly larger. Okay, next slide. So these are the 11 promising birth to 5 literacy interventions that we found. You see a number at the end of them, and it includes, that's the number out of 100 children we would expect to see with improved outcomes. If a program had more than one outcome, we list the results for the largest impact. Sometimes there's evidence that these programs can move the needle for more than one indicator. And if you recall, I mean, we had number of kids that would be we could expect to see with improved outcomes that were much smaller, right? So it ranged, typically for elementary school from 3 to 7 kids. That's not a large number out of 100. And all of these, either meet or exceed that benchmark, and some significantly. One thing I would also point out is that if you look at them from top to bottom, the intensity of the intervention goes down. So the low intensity, kind of low effort kinds of interventions are roughly grouped around the bottom. Like Dolly Parton Imagination Library, great program where kids are getting mailed a book once a month. That's a low intensity intervention. Whereas Story Talk at the top is a curriculum and professional development program for pre-K classrooms, where we're teaching pre-K teachers how to have shared, really using dialogic reading or interactive shared reading with pre-K children, so much more intensive. But what you can see is this allows us to benchmark the impact of these interventions and have a little more confidence in terms of how effective are these interventions compared to what we might see otherwise, and to be able to make decisions about trade-offs among different interventions. Some of these are hitting some of the same outcomes or indicators, and it would allow you to make some decisions. There are lots of trade-offs: cost, difficulty of implementation, etc. But it gives you a little more information to make some decisions about. Next slide, please. And these are the 11 promising K-3 literacy interventions that came out of our review. Again, you see a range of outcomes. The numbers aren't necessarily as large as birth to 5 in some cases. But again, some of these are programs you may have heard about before, and this is giving you a little more substance to understand what the impact might be if implemented with fidelity and relative to other interventions. But again, the trade-offs are really important. I would call attention to the first one on the list, reading recovery. Lots of research, lots of evidence to show that it can help first graders for phonics, very expensive and hard to implement. So these are the kinds of trade-offs that we need to take into account. And the next slide. I'd like to point out that 2 of these are actually homegrown from the state of North Carolina interventions. HELPS, which is a great fluency intervention, was developed here in the state of North Carolina at NC State. And then targeted reading intervention was developed also here in the state by researchers at Chapel Hill. So, it's nice to have a couple of interventions that made the list that are also homegrown. So that's the presentation I have for this morning. Lots of information, I know. I hope it was helpful, and look forward to your questions and talking with you a little bit.
Thank you so much, Monroe. I'm sure everyone can see that this is really groundbreaking work. We're really excited to be able to have Monroe in North Carolina and share this with you. We at the North Carolina Early Childhood Foundation plan to be working with Monroe to be able to put this into an accessible guide later this year that hopefully will be a good resource to those around the state, and frankly, I think around the country, because Monroe, I think it's fair to say, right, that one reason you had to do this amount of work was because it didn't exist. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, we really wished at the time, we did this 2 years ago, and we really wish we didn't have to, but there are some new resources like ESSA, evidence for ESSA that are out, but still, I think going the extra mile and being able to talk in terms of, how many kids out of 100 would likely have improved outcomes, I think that's more useful than just giving folks, some number that, is hard to understand.
Yes, I can tell you that I have learned a lot through your presentation and your work as well. And so, folks, I imagine there are a lot of questions. If you type them into the question, we have too many people on the webinar to be able to do this verbally. But if you type your questions into the question box, I will ask them of Monroe. And so the first one I have, I suspect the answer is no, but did you look at parents as teachers?
I actually did look at parents as teachers, and it's one of the most reviewed programs. It's on the HomeV website. Parents as teachers does have evidence for other outcomes, but unfortunately, there was no strong evidence for early language or early literacy skills. I take this as simply, however, the beginning of a conversation. And it's more, so the question I ask is, why don't we see more impact for early language literacy skills, and what might we do differently? Here in Mecklenburg County, the YMCA of Greater Charlotte, which runs Parents as Teachers, they've incorporated the active reading or dialogic reading into Parents as Teachers. They've trained all their parent educators in active reading, and I believe next month are starting to incorporate this into their home visits. And I think it's an example of where you can take an evidence-based practice and incorporate it into programs to try to take advantage of where we do have evidence.
So, and I think it's an important point to make. You'll correct me if I'm wrong, Monroe. It's not to suggest that these programs don't have very significant outcomes in other areas, but that in focusing on the indicators you were looking at, that perhaps that's not where you would see impact from them. And I think, so one, is that correct? And my other question would be, or what you're pointing out, is that how do we look for existing access points to families and parents to add a layer that might impact early literacy?
You're absolutely right, Tracy, on both counts.
Great. So will we have access? Everyone will have, so this presentation is being recorded and you will have access to that as well as the presentation itself. Let's see. Some of these questions are long, so give me a moment. Okay. So this person says, I work with different groups that are getting more interested in literacy programs, but choosing a program is overwhelming, of course. Yes, that's exactly why we're having this conversation. And it's great to see a list of the interventions, but how should we select a few for time's sake to offer up to groups very new to this? So do you have any advice in that regard?
Well, it obviously depends on what age range you're looking at. So some of these programs are easier to get up and going than others. And I think my advice would be to think about either programs you already have that you might be able to scale up, or programs where the lift is a lot easier, and anything that's turnkey, that's easier to support to get started like that. I certainly recommend it. So I'll pick one. Reach Out and Read, which, it's been around nationally since 1989. We've got a state organization, Reach Out and Read Carolinas, that we work with that cover both the Carolinas. That's really a, kind of a turnkey kind of program. And, that's the kind of program where you could, really in short order, work with Reach Out and Read Carolinas and, be able to start to access families, right, through well child visits. There are other programs like that as well. Dolly Parton Imagination Library, Raising a Reader. I think those kind of turnkey kind of programs are probably where I would start first.
And I would imagine there's some leveraging that could be done. So because we now have a state investment in expanding access to Dolly Parton Imagination Library, for example, perhaps there are interventions that could be added on top of that or in combination with that to take advantage of the books in homes.
Absolutely. We call that stacking and aligning. And so, one example is one of the other interventions that we support here in Mecklenburg County is the Ready for K text messaging service. And so we've got posters promoting active reading in doctor's offices that have Reach Out and Read. And so we try to do that kind of cross promoting as well. So I think absolutely that's possible. And should be encouraged.
Someone would like to know, have you seen any results so far in Charlotte-Meck, anything measurable?
Yeah, so I think in the early period, if you think about results, it's both qualitative and quantitative. And, we in 2017 focused on early birth to 5 programs because we knew we had less time to intervene there. One way to think about this is we won't see the impact of some of those early birth to 5 investments until after 2021 or 2022. So, we're looking for more of a hockey stick kind of change in outcomes here after a lot of early investment. What I will say qualitatively, though, that we certainly are operating differently in Mecklenburg County, partly because of the stacking and aligning, but also sometimes moving from kind of organic implementation to real intentional partnership. So one of the things we're proud of, for example, Reach Out and Read, is we've got Novant Health and Atrium Health both at the table working with us and Reach Out and Read Carolinas in a real intentional way that hasn't really happened before. I certainly also want to point out and give a shout out to Smart Start of Mecklenburg County that played a critical role in helping to support Reach Out and Read here in Mecklenburg County. And I think it's an example where you can take something that already exists, it's been supported at a certain level, and then really look at how can you kind of take that to the next level. So it's still early days for us in terms of kind of measurable results for kids, but I think in terms of the qualitative work of people coming together, like we can count those stories of people starting to work together in different ways, and that's what you need to have happen before you can get to the quantitative results with regards to early literacy achievement.
Great. Here's a challenging one. So if you had to summarize your presentation in 1 or 2 sentences, what would you say?
Okay. Always ask, what's the evidence? Not everything has evidence that it works. Choose the most promising things.
I think that's great. And I would say I have learned a lot from Monroe, and reinforced with this presentation, as you said, about really understanding the difference between what it means when we say effect size. So that's been really helpful. Okay, so someone would like to know, what about all the Mother Read programs?
Yeah, so that's I'm glad. I was hoping someone would ask about Mother Read. So it's an example of a program, and there are lots of them that have been around for a long time. I'm sure have had some really good results. Unfortunately, we couldn't find any of the kind of research that I pointed out, right? Where we were looking for research that had, either random assignment or match comparison group. And then we really prefer research that's been done by a third party. And we just could not find any of that kind of research for Mother Read. And I want to be clear, for whether it's Mother Read or any program, us not being able to have that kind of evidence to look at doesn't mean that that they're not effective. It just simply means I don't know.
Right. And I think that's a really important point, that, as Monroe stated at the beginning of his presentation, they laid out certain criteria for what would be considered a powerful strategy. And the type of evidence available was one of the criteria that was put to the work.
Yeah, and I would just point out that highlights the need for groups to help support the evaluation of programs, because in some ways, we're hindered by not knowing. And there are a number of programs that have been around for 20 plus years that are national programs that are not on our list because there has not been that kind of research to help support it. And frankly, from my standpoint, it's frustrating because we really would like to know and be able to include them on the list, right? The same way that we do other programs.
Someone is wondering, is there a list of programs that you looked at that did not meet the criteria?
Yes, we don't normally talk about it because we try to be more positive, but we looked at a lot more programs. I'm always willing to talk about that privately or individually.
Yeah.
But you should not assume because a group is not on the list, that it means that it wasn't effective. More times than not, it's just there wasn't the level of there was not the research needed to be able to answer the question.
Okay, so the next question is around, this person is acknowledging that active reading is being implemented in Charlotte. Are some of the others that are on the list, like Story Talk, also a part of your strategic plan?
Oh, great question. So we have a great partnership with Child Care Resources, Inc., which is our resource and referral agency here in Mecklenburg County. And we have a great project that we started late last year called Ready to Read. And it's a demonstration project where we're stacking and aligning 4 evidence-based interventions. Raising a reader is the base intervention. We're bringing active reading workshops to families in the participating child care centers. Ready for Read, so the text messaging service that sends age and developmentally appropriate text from birth to up to 60 months for kids. And then Story Talk, which is basically, what I describe, it's interactive shared reading curriculum PD program developed by Barbara Wasik out of Temple University. And so all 4 of those are being stacked and aligned together. and they're being used in child care programs here in Mecklenburg County. We're doing something a little different. There are 2 randomized controlled trials for that study, one in public pre-K and one in Head Start programs, and we are actually implementing it outside of Head Start or public pre-K. So, 4 and 5 star centers basically, but it's they're not all of the teachers have 4-year diplomas or have bachelor's degrees, etc. So we are actually trying to do something different here, and but yeah, that's where we're piloting Story Talk, and over the next 3 years, I think we'll have about 1,000 kids kind of in a total between our treatment and comparison group that we'll be looking at to evaluate the impact of that stacking and aligning.
That's great. How are you engaging faith communities in your work?
Oh, great question. So we've been working really hard on that over the last several years, and in Charlotte, we have so many different ministries, and unfortunately, there's not just one place you can go and connect with all of them. But we've, I think, been making some headway there, and I do a lot of talking around the county. We actually have a meeting coming up in a couple of weeks where we're bringing together the faith community, and really what we're trying to do is for houses of worship that have a relationship with a school, we want to help them to enhance their partnerships and to help make it more effective. So if you think about the Reading Success Pathway, it's really around helping them to understand what skills we need to move the needle on, building that school level partnership so that we have good formative data, so that we understand what kids need help, and then really wrapping and aligning efforts around empowering families, providing tutoring, book access, and then stopping summer reading loss. And so we're building, in partnership with some members of the faith community, a strategy around helping to be an advisor to the faith community and schools to build more effective school faith community partnerships.
That's great. So what strategies or programs are you using to reach children that might not be in any formalized care center?
Yeah, so I would say the ones that we right now are carrying the most weight for us are Ready for K and Reach Out and Read. I know that Smart Start's also working on expanding access to Dolly Parton Imagination Library with state funding, and we're starting to work with them to help with some of the helping to amplify some of the marketing. We do a lot of digital and Facebook marketing, and so we want to try to help with that as well. But I would particularly point to Reach Out and Read and Ready for K for 2 reasons. So Reach Out and Read, 96% of kids go to at least, 96% of kids whose parents graduate from college go to at least one well child visit a year. For kids whose parents dropped out of high school, it's 79%. It's incredibly high, and we think it's one of the best ways to reach families that are otherwise hard to reach. In our conversations with Reach Out and Read Carolinas, we talk about it as a platform to reach families. And so I would certainly encourage communities to think about how they use the medical home as a platform to reach families. And I think Reach Out and Read is one of the best ways to do that. The other one, Ready for K, I also point out as well, there's just such great, I'll say, bones or fundamentals with text messaging. It is the most popular app on a phone. 97% of all text messages get read in the first 3 minutes, and millennials carry their phone with them 22 hours a day. I mean, it's just literally one of the best ways to reach families. And so I think those are 2 strategies. Obviously, there are other things we do, like the active reading family workshops, to try to reach families regardless of where they're at. But those are nice broad reaches that as a platform you can use to make connections to other interventions.
Okay, we have some questions about specific programs. I'm not going to go through all of them because I think that list could be endless, but I'm going to raise 2 that have come up several times in the questions. One is what you have found out about Letterland, and the other one is Vroom.
Okay, so Letterland, I cannot find any evidence that it's been evaluated experimentally the way that we talked about. Letterland is used here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. I've looked at it again recently online. I can't see anything. What I will tell you is because of ESSA, though, I've seen over the last 2 years more of these companies behind these different products really talking more about evidence-based. And there's more research coming all the time. You may have seen level literacy intervention in the list. When I first compiled the list 2 years ago, it wasn't on the list. It wasn't there. Now it's shown up because there's the independent third-party research to help support it. So don't know any yet, but we're always looking. And Vroom, similarly, I have not been able to find any research behind Vroom, so I just simply don't know. And I've looked, I just haven't seen it. And again, hopefully what you saw on that slide with those 24 or whatever databases, it's just really hard right now to find programs because they're not all listed in one place. And even sometimes if they're listed, like the What Works Clearinghouse, it can be buried in the website. And it's not as simple as just clicking on, show me all the literacy interventions. One I'll point out is HELPS. The one I mentioned that was developed by a professor at NC State. It has the biggest impact on fluency and the biggest impact on comprehension of any intervention we've seen, period. And it was included in the practice guide for What Works Clearinghouse on K-3 comprehension, but frustratingly, it's not on the list of literacy interventions if you just click on the list. So we still have a lot of work to do in the field of making it easier for practitioners to find interventions that work.
And I think actually, I want to confirm that I have this right, Monroe, that your standard was frankly higher than the What Works Clearinghouse. You used that as your starting point to look at evaluations and research to then see if it met your standard for what you thought would be needed in Charlotte-Meck. Is that correct?
Well, I would slightly modify it. I would say What Works Clearinghouse is the standard everyone uses in terms of what's the quality of research that's needed. What I would say is we didn't stop there because it takes a long time for interventions to get included in the What Works Clearinghouse. And sometimes you find interventions on other websites. And as long as they met those criteria, we would consider them for our own search purposes.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. We've hit the hour mark. I see still several questions, particularly around the slides. The slides and the recording of the webinar will be available. We will send that out via email and post it on our website as well. And Monroe, I want to give you a huge thanks, one, for the tremendous work you have done, not only in Mecklenburg County, but really this work, I really believe will advance the field nationally. If it didn't exist, then you were certainly not the only one who needed it. So thank you for all of that and for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with all of us.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Tracy, and appreciate your leadership in the state of North Carolina. We couldn't do it without all of you.
Great. Okay, everyone, have a great weekend.